So the second of the 12 steps of ecological recovery came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. There's a lot of wisdom in the 12-step tradition about this power greater than the self. People who got into recovery from alcoholism in the 1930s, this small band of mostly men, and they had tried everything they knew, and they had exhausted every possible avenue for a cure, except one, which was the spiritual solution. So the story goes that one day Bill was, back from one of his numerous rehabs, and really sort of, he made so many false resolves to get sober and just couldn't do it. And so his friend Evie Thatcher showed up, and Evie had been part of the Oxford group, and he'd sort of got religion, seemed like, and he showed up and he was sober. Bill welcomed him when he called and said he was coming over, because he thought, an old drinking buddy who'll just come by, I can just get totally shit-faced with him and just forget it all for a while. Maybe the pain will go away for at least a few hours. But he showed up and he wasn't drinking. And he said, "What's this about?" And he says, "Well, I've been on a spiritual program of recovery." And Wilson said famously, he said he went from being a crackpot to being cracked about religion. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. He said that he didn't want to have anything to do with the God of his upbringing, who he referred to as the Tsar of Heaven. Okay, the Tsar of Heaven. Didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so Evie, fortunately, was a person more interested in recovery than in religion. And so in an inspired moment, he said, "Well, why don't you just find a conception of God that makes sense to you?" And that was the magical moment, as it were. Find a conception of God that makes sense to you. And that was the wiggle room. That was the permission that allowed him to begin to rebuild his theology from the ground up. Now, most of us in the modern age suffer fairly seriously damaged theologies. Those people who tell you that their theologies are watertight or airtight, and fundamentalists, people who will argue you tooth and nail, argue you to the ground about their theology and why it's right. Even those people's theology is pretty severely damaged. You can't really live in the modern world with a traditional theological notion of God and really be standing on firm ground. It's very, very wobbly, and it's because it's been handed down to us from on high, rather than built by ourselves from the ground up. When we build our own conception of a power beyond the self, building it ourselves, laying the groundwork carefully, and in direct contact with our own feelings and our own beliefs and our own ideas, it's quite stable and quite functional and quite practical. It actually works, because it really does. It isn't out there. There's really nothing to doubt. There's really nothing to struggle against, because we're not being told by anyone what to believe. We're being invited to discover what it is that we believe. So the question always comes down in this model. The question always comes down to, can you at least feel a willingness to believe in a power greater than yourself? And people have a variety of different responses. Some person will come in and will say, "Well, yes, as a child I believed in God, and really I still do believe in God, so God is my higher power." Another person will say, "There's no way I can believe in God." And they believe that means they can't really believe in a power beyond the self. And so it becomes a bit of a journey for that person, because they have to completely re-articulate from the ground up what a power beyond the self might mean. And there are a lot of ways into that. Some people will believe in the power of the group. literally a power outside of the self, relying on other people for support. Other people will believe in the power of nature. Some people will quite literally believe in like scientific principles and things like that. They'll believe that the world is governed by scientific principles that are inexorable and which are sort of beyond their reach or beyond their ability to calculate, and so something new could always happen. So people can believe in a lot of different things. The wisdom of this movement states that you can believe in anything as long as it isn't you, as long as it really is a power greater than or other than the self. Now, the movement is described as often as a higher power. Not always, but often as a higher power. Sometimes it's described as God, sometimes as the spirit of the universe, sometimes as life force. If you look in AA literature, it pretty much crosses the full spectrum because there is a plurality and a diversity of views about what that higher power or other power or greater power might be. So, when we say that we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, we've admitted two things. One is that we can't help ourselves and we have to rely on something outside of ourselves. Two, that we are mad, that we are crazy. Now let's talk a little bit about what this means in terms of ecological recovery. What does it mean that we're insane? Well, one thing it means is that we're so crazy the world looks sane to us. We're so crazy that the world of consumerism looks sane. We're so crazy that the world of disposable products and planned obsolescence and acceptable levels of poverty and acceptable casualties in war, and the list goes on and on and on, that these things are manageable and acceptable to us is in itself absolutely and utterly insane. But we don't see it because it's normalized. We don't see it because it's widely accepted. Because our insanity is shared by most people, to us it seems sane. That is a beautiful story, which I told at the funeral of Mark Robeson, our local resident Buddha, who lived here until he died about this time last year. Mark used to walk around the streets of the town passing out little stones with Om or Om Mani Padme Hum, the mantras written on them. And Mark was quite a colorful, eccentric, and crazy figure as well. Crazy and sane. Crazy some moments very wise. But at Mark's funeral I told this story. It's from the teachings of Reb Nachman of Breslov, who we've talked a lot about in this group. Reb Nachman tells the story of a king and a prime minister who is also the king's best friend. The king said to the prime minister, "I have seen in the stars that everyone who eats from this year's grain will go insane. What do you think we shall do?" Prime Minister said, "We should set aside a portion of good grain that we may eat from it, that we will not be afflicted." The king said, "No, this we must not do. For if we eat the good grain and everyone else eats the tainted grain, then everyone else will be insane, and they will look at us and think that we are the crazy ones. No, what we will do is this. We will eat from the tainted grain like everyone else, but I will place a sign on your forehead, and you will place a sign on my forehead, and when we see it, at least we will know that we are mad." It's a beautiful story. And of course, if you know anything at all about Hasidic Judaism, you know that the sign on the forehead is the tefillin, right? It's the little leather box with the scriptures in them that's worn on the wrist and worn on the forehead. So it's the sign of Judaism. So basically what Reb Nachman is saying is that a Jewish mystic is no different from any other human being except that he knows that he's crazy. Okay? The addict is absolutely no different than any other human being except for one thing. He or she knows he's an addict. So a person in ecological recovery in this society is just exactly the same as everybody else, completely caught in the net, the web of cause and effect, and the whole terrible machinery of consumption. But there's one difference. That person knows that they are addicted. That person knows that their lives is completely driven by excess, and knowing that, consciously makes the decision one day at a time to abstain from the craziness of thinking that he or she knows how to run the planet better than the planet. And that one factor is really what it is that we practice. That is really what we embrace, that one truth. We don't know better than the planet how to run the planet. And we remind ourselves of this again and again. The planet itself, the earth, is the power greater than the self, okay, that can restore us to sanity. And sanity is simply living by our needs rather than by our desires. Our desires are never satisfied. Our needs are. You can't take more breath into your body than you can take. Likewise, drinking water. I suppose you could drink so much water you killed yourself, but even if you did, you'd only drink as much as your body could hold. It's like a glass poured up to the very top. When it reaches the top, it overflows. It will hold no more. Our needs are like this. Needs are finite. Needs are finite. Desires are infinite. Mahayana Buddhism teaches desires are numberless. That's the first of the great vows for all. I vow to vanquish them all. That's the first Bodhisattva vow. Desires are infinite. Desires are numberless. I vow to vanquish them all. Nevertheless, the approach in Buddhism is a little bit different than our approach here. The Buddhist traditionally will make it a matter of discipline and a matter of lifestyle, and a matter of following a monastic rule, not to indulge in excess. Okay, so there's a sort of an idea that by not indulging in excess, we can overcome desire. By becoming master of our own bodies and minds, we can somehow negate the effects of desire, and in so doing, we can transcend suffering. The cultural addict or excess addict knows that in fact it doesn't really work that way so much, because we know that in fact we're never going to overcome excess. Human beings are given, modern human beings are given to excess. From agricultural times on, we have been accumulating surpluses, more than we need. And we live by this one word, more. More, 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 and more. Always more. Never less. Even our concept of time is more. Even our concept of evolution is an arrow pointing forward towards some greater or better goal, rather than to the present and satisfaction and peace and tranquility in the present, with the present. And so we are not going to get over that. What we're going to do is we're going to own up to it and live it and relate to it and find a relationship of honesty to that. And in doing so, we get a reprieve for one day, which is infinitely renewable. That's the beauty of it. It's very important not to develop a relationship of pride to these steps, because pride really doesn't have any place in them. They're really an antidote to pride. Pride is really the problem, not the solution. And so came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity reminds us that we are not all-powerful and that we are mad. It's a good place to start, on that foundation, that we are not all-powerful and that we are mad. Some basic baseline happiness and sanity can be reclaimed and rebuilt.